LLinusLLove and DavyJones are two of the biggest cash game crushers, but how much does their cash knowledge help in a tournament against some elite MTT players? Can one of them win this $25,000 tournament for $450,000? In this tournament, we'll see players show one specific skill over and over again, and it's one that is completely underrated and not focused on enough. Let's see if you can catch it. Fish 2013, aka Mikita Badziakowski, is one of the most successful players in both cash games and tournaments. But his $75 million in tournament cashes show that tournaments have been his primary focus in recent years. Still, this first round goes to cash game crusher DavyJones. Not long after, Linus knocks on the door. Is there any way for Mikita to not lose his stack here? Well, if there is, then just calling the 4-bet instead of jamming is one of the few ways to do so. Now if that call surprises you, you will be even more surprised that in theory, queens wouldn't even be a 3-bet in the first place. That's because when working with a limping range for the small blind, which is very reasonable to assume Linus will have here, the solver would limp most of his hands, and only a very polarized range would even open raise, which would make pocket queens profit less from 3-betting, as that filters out most worst hands, while keeping in all better hands and hands with good equity against it. And even if we only allowed the small blind to open raise and not limp, queens would still mix calls in 3-bets. And 3-bet a really polarized range in general. So just calling is probably the optimal play in reality when Linus will have a limping range. Still, just calling the 4-bet instead of jamming allows you to look for a safe flop. And when the flop is not safe, you can still fold. After we lose the first player, we see another battle between legends. And this time, arguably the best tournament player alive cannot survive against DavyJones' better hand. After a change of seats, we continue with some heat. As the short stack at the table, Fish manages to get away from pocket 10s against an open and a 3-bet, which is not only GTO, but also saves him from running into DavyJones' pocket queens, who then happily picks up the pot uncontested. Back to Linus. King-Jack off is a clear defend against the min raise from under the gun. He doesn't flop anything, but when the chip leader checks back the flop, a king is one of the best turns he can get. And even still, he just check folds. Which might look surprising, but let's think about what Leckendon's range might look like here. The fact that he bets 70% pot on a turn polarizes his range enough so that you shouldn't ever assume him to bet a hand like King X here. Which means he would have either Ace-X or better, or air. But on such a favorable flop for the chip leader that is even a range bet for the solver, it's probably unlikely for him to ever check behind with pure air instead of just trying to take down the pot. So when there's very few air that even arrives on the turn, the polarized range is likely lacking one of the poles. And even in theory, the solver would mix calls and folds with all King X in Linus's shoes. And that is even based on the premise that Lackenden would bet hands like pocket 10s through 7s for this size on the turn, which in my opinion is rather unlikely. So folding King Jack is not only theory approved, but also makes even more sense in practice. We lose another MTT legend and resume the battle between Linus and the chip leader. Again, Linus finds himself behind on the flop. And again, he can find a nice fold on the turn. Meanwhile, DavyJones does the one thing you should be good at as an MTT player. Winning flips. So far we've seen players make some great plays. Plays that didn't win them chips, but prevented them from losing a lot more than they did. Which can be worth even more, especially in an MTT, where your chips are your tournament life. Let's see if DavyJones can do the same. He flats Jack-9 suited against the chip leader, which is good, and flops top pair. With an exception to the flop bet, both players' actions here are very in line with GTO. Until it goes to the river. 50% pot is actually the best sizing for the solver with Jack-10 suited, and we'll see that Jack-9 of hearts is a pure call. However, the fact that the club combo is a pure fold, as are many other hands as well, tells us the decision is probably very close in theory. And Davy's spidey senses seem to tell him that here, in reality, it's a fold. So with 10 big blinds saved by making this great fold, he goes into another round with the chip leader. With Queen Jack, the flop would mostly be bet small, but betting big isn't a crime. Going for a big pot bet on the turn is much appreciated by the solver, and on the river, Queen Jack with a club blocker should be a nice hand to bluff with, right? Well, only in less than 5% of the time. Considering we have so many other offsuit hands that include the Jack, Queen, King, and even better Ace of clubs, we have to remember keeping our bluffing frequencies in check. Another great spot to save yourself some chips. Which brings us to one of the most interesting hands at this final table. Linus opens King-Queen suited and Lackenden calls King-5 suited. Here we see that limping is even more of a thing than in the spot earlier. If we ask the solver, it would virtually limp its entire range, including King-Queen suited. But since that is apparently not the case here in practice, we'll make our lives easier and just work with the small blinds range that would only play a raise first and no fold strategy, where King-Queen suited would always open. King-5 suited would always call, and we see a King-High flop. With only 22 big blinds, Linus c-bets less than 25% pot and gets called, both of which are standard plays. On the turn, Linus can bet again, and a small size is exactly what makes the most use out of his overall range advantage. It allows him to value bet thinner and limits the amount of chips he plays for, which is important when it's easy to just lose all of them quickly. A raise like this would happen sometimes, but never with King-5. The worst value hand that would raise more often than it would call here would be King-Queen. But besides that, and some Queen-Jack, pocket 3s and 9-10s, there are also a decent amount of bluffs that could do this. 9x, Ace-X, and Queen and Jack-X hands. And against that range, clicking it back would be what the solver would do. 1/3 of the time, so really often. Since King 5 would never raise the turn in theory, we can't compare Lekkenden's play to the solver. But the closest hand to it, King 7 suited, would always call. The river brings a jack, which shuffles things up again. Linus makes a straight, as would a large part of his range that 3-bet the turn in theory. More than 50% of his hands would be a straight here, while the big blind would have less than 30% straights in his range. So with this large of a range and nut advantage, Linus can definitely bet. The interesting part is in how much. Despite having only 1/3 pot left, the solver would prefer a 10% pot bet and never jam all in. That is the impact that ICM has on the optimal strategy. Because ICM optimizes to have a player lose his entire stack as rarely as possible so that he can ladder up and win more money. Without ICM, the solver would only care about making the most amount of chips in the long run and not consider any prize money. So if we solve this river spot without having ICM included, the solver would basically only ever jam all in instead of betting 10%. And when a cash game player knows that much about ICM, is he really just a cash game player? Another tournament player has to go, and it's 2 cash game rags against 2 tournament rags. We resume our most frequent battle. And the outcome we've seen so often. Davy dodging bullets like Neo. After Siluan busts as well, we are now 2-1 cash versus MTT pros. Lekkenden then shoots a shot against Linus and wins the flip, which opens the stage for the ultimate cash game versus tournament crusher heads up. And here we'll witness one of the most epic heads up performances I have seen. It starts off with some action. DavyJones 3-bets Ace-Jack suited against Queen 10 off and c-bets his top pair on Jack 8-8 with 2 hearts. His range wants to c-bet only 1/3 of the time here, but basically any hand could mix in a bet. Lekkenden, who has 1 heart, decides to bluff raise. He might try to represent having an 8, a jack that wants to protect against overcards, or maybe even a slow played overpair. The solver doesn't like it with this hand and would rather raise hands with more equity like flush draws or less equity like pure ace highs. But overall, the raising frequency is very low. Davy then goes ahead and clicks it back, which is exactly what the solver would do. It benefits from getting value from weaker jack-eggs, while also preventing hands that have overcards and or weak draws, just like Queen 10, from realizing their equity. And the next hand is just pure odd. Davy opens Ace-3 and checks back on 2-3-4 with 3 clubs. On the turn, Lekkenden leads for 1/3 pot, which is a valid bet, and Ace-3 is a clear call. The river is now a clear check for 7-4, as it's too weak to value bet and too good to bluff. Ace-3 on the other hand is still good enough for a value bet, even though the board looks very scary with both flushes possible as well as a 1-card straight. That's because the big blind's range is still very wide in this spot. After calling the preflop raise, betting small on the turn, and checking the river, there are still so many pairs that can bluff catch. 6x, 4x, 3x, deuce-x, and even king highs would be calling according to the solver. 7-4 specifically would actually have to fold, but since the very next best hand 8-4 and also every other 4x would be calls, it cannot be a big mistake to call 7-4 here. But raising? That's a different story. In theory, there would be plenty of bluff raises happening, just like there would be a lot of value raises. But every check raise bluff would have to include a club, because the blocker allows for the most amount of fold equity. And raising other hands on top will likely have you over bluffing by a huge amount. Which is a bad idea when DavyJones isn't having it. So what we witnessed on this final table, not only by Davy Jones, but also by Linus, Mikita and other elite players, is that getting away from hands that could easily be justified as standard coolers, and thereby protecting your tournament life, is one of the most important skills in MTTs. And even more impressive is when the player that has been practicing it the most on this final table switches it up to make extremely difficult calls. Exactly at the right time. If you want to get better at poker, make sure to join the 2cc Discord community through the link down below, where you'll find other ambitious players and additional content all for free. And if you like this video format, you will also like this one, where 3 of the world's most successful tournament players battle for 180k.